Good evening, everyone. It's 7:30, so I guess we'll make a start. I'm Jan Ledoux. I'm chairman of the Southeast region of NSA, and I'd like to welcome you to this, our third and concluding evening of SHWAP. This acronym stands for Sheep, Health, Wealth and Production, just in case you didn't know. Well, tonight, having looked at health on the first night on Monday, and how to create wealth on the second night on Tuesday, we effectively get to the P for production, with the topic for this evening being annual feed budgeting. I'm delighted to welcome our Southeast Regional Vice Chair, sheep farmer and award-winning shearer, and you'll see she's got a British wool jacket on, Susie Parish, to chair this evening's session. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you very much, Jan. Just before we start, just a bit of housekeeping to do. So if anyone wishes to attain SQPs for Rosa or AMTRA, please put your name and registration number in the chat box. And if any of you have questions for our speakers throughout this evening, please write your name and questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll be able to see them there and put them to Kate and Sam as the evening goes on, or at the Q&A at the end. So it's names and registration numbers in the chat box and questions in the Q&A box, please. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this event. So it's MSD, Elanco, Rapper, AgriWeb, and our mainline sponsors, British Wool and Cotswold Seeds. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this evening, Sam Lane. Sam is the technical manager at Cotswold Seeds. He grew up in an agricultural community in Oxfordshire and studied for a degree in agriculture at Harper Adams, after which he worked for 4 years on Swinbrook Estate. Sam joined Cotswold Seeds 9 years ago, and as well as providing farmers with advice on complex grass seed mixtures and visiting farms all over the UK, Sam regularly represents Cotswold Seeds at the agricultural shows. Sam's also co-authored many of the Cotswold Seeds technical publications, including the Herbal Ley Farming System, Mob Grazing Guide, and Sort Out Your Soil. Sam has been actively involved with FarmEd's Cotswold Seeds Centre for Farm and Food Education, including helping to plan and manage the crop rotation at the heart of the farm. So over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Susie. That's great. I'm going to have to cut down that bio a little bit at some point. I'm going to try and share my screen and see if we can make a start. Okie dokie. Can everybody see that? Yep, thank you, Nicola. That's a good thumbs up. Right, thank you very much. I've got about 25 minutes now, and yeah, I'm Sam, Cotswold Seeds. We do a lot with sheep farmers, and we're looking tonight where we might be able to slot in some homegrown forage in our rotation, trying to make the most of the gaps we can find. And this, of course, might be short-term stuff, and it could be longer-term lays as well. So I'm going to go straight into it because we haven't got a huge amount of time, and I think we can do some questions as we get towards the end. Okay, so where are our opportunities to maximise homegrown forage? There's a few, I think, to think about. So we could be thinking about specialist crops, so lamb fattening crops, which I'm sure you've all dealt with before, stubble turnips, forage rape, that sort of thing. And I'll come on to those different species and what we need to be aware of in a minute. Interestingly, we're seeing more and more issues with grass-to-grass reseeds and problems with grass and pests, wireworm and leather jackets. So I think the idea of bringing in more break crops, which are normally based around brassicas, could be really useful, but also could provide another useful break crop from a sheep point of view. Arable rotation break crops, and of course, more and more we're hearing about SFI and stewardship, and we might be able to find opportunities within the arable rotation for short-term cover crops. And these can be really useful over winter grazing, so it might be putting ewes somewhere where they're not going to get too fat or put on too much condition. Or the other end of the scale, we might be fattening lambs over winter on some of these opportunities. And of course, the handy thing is if we've been looking at our grass pastures all year, it might give us an opportunity to get away from them to get some clean grazing as well. Okay, so short-term forage options. Where do we need to start? Well, I sort of think we need to almost go backwards. We need to be thinking about when we're going to utilise these short-term options. So are we thinking of pre-Christmas, possibly, Christmas, January time, or are we thinking of almost early spring? And from that, we can work out what we need to plant that's actually going to last or get to that point in the season. And that can work two ways, of course. We could plant things that need a long time to grow too late and we don't get the crop we're looking for. Or we could plant short-term species that actually run out of steam or might not last into maybe February time or even early March. So we've got to be careful as to what our sort of growing period is. So some of these short-term forage crops are 10 to 12 weeks, roughly speaking. Other ones are 20 weeks, and they're the ones we've got to think about getting in a bit earlier. And then as we think about maybe some longer term species, we might want species that will be grazed, but actually will then regrow and go into the following season. And I think that's when we start to look at our more perennial species. Again, I'll come on to those species in a minute. Okay, so I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with stubble turnips. They can be a really useful short-term forage crop. They've got a pretty good protein content, 17%, roughly speaking. And interestingly, they give us that 10 to 12 week from sowing to the earliest utilisation period. So again, they can go in fairly late, probably mid-end of August if we're really pushing things, and still give us a decent crop around Christmas time. Yield potential compared to some species we'll talk about tonight is not as high as it could be, but they're still pretty good. They're reliable, and we've got a few different varieties to choose from. I won't go into varieties too much tonight because it will get can take too long. But we know that they're small seeds from our point of view. That's what we deal with every day, is the seed side of things, which means they don't need to be sown at a particularly high sowing rate, which can make them pretty cheap, which is great. Interestingly, in good conditions, when we see people dropping these sowing rates down, so we might be at a standard rate of 2 kilos an acre, 5 kilos a hectare. If we come down from that, you tend to give the bulbs a bit more space, and therefore more space normally means bigger bulbs. And conversely, don't be too keen to go too high on the sowing rates, because that can lead to not enough space for the bulbs, and then we end up with what we call a lot of pencils, which is a lot of top growth and very thin bulbs. So just be careful when you're thinking about sowing stubble turnips. You want to get it right. Forage rape is another short-term species we might consider for some of our breaks. Normally, again, sort of maybe end of July to August time from a planting point of view, or possibly even from late spring to get us round to autumn if we're thinking of a reseed and again a grass to grass brassica break. Growth period about 10 to 12 weeks, again slightly higher protein content than the turnips when they're sown as a pure stand. Similar sort of yield. Interestingly, obviously the forage rape is leaf and no bulb, so the stock tend to go through it quite quickly. So it won't hold them for as long as a good crop of stubble turnips will. We actually do a mixture of the two, 75% turnips, so we're trying to hold them for as long as possible, but also 25% forage rape, again, just trying to push that protein content up a little bit. I should also mention, I haven't got a slide for this one, but there's quite a useful one for, again, short-term breaks. So things like a leafy turnip, so things like Typhon, for example, that's a non-bulbing turnip, and that can actually give you a crop in probably 8 to 10 weeks in good conditions. And again, we're seeing it as quite a useful one when we have got a very short part of the rotation, or again, if we're trying to maybe just break a grass lay in April, get a break of a brassica in that's going to grow quickly. We're not waiting for it to bulb up like a stubble turnip and then get back into grass in early autumn. So a Typhon leafy turnip can work really well in that period as well. Hybrid rape kales, slightly newer. Not many things become new in our industry. It takes a while to get anything new to come through, but these are a little bit more recent. And basically what they've done is cross a true kale plant and a forage rape plant. And it's a really handy thing because you can get the speed of establishment of forage rape. So we're back to that sort of 10 or 12 weeks. But the winter hardiness and the regrowth potentially of the kale parent as well. So suddenly we've got something that's 18, 20% protein, but would establish in 10 to 12 weeks with a slightly higher yield, I would argue, than forage rapes or stubble turnips. So again, fast growth, but good winter hardiness could be really useful. And interestingly, some of these varieties can offer some really good regrowth if we graze them a little bit carefully early on. So if we had planted this in, say, mid-August, we might be grazing it before Christmas, not grazing it too hard, not taking it right down to the ground. And then after a rest, you would hope to go back round again. A couple of varieties to think about. Interval is one. It's a little bit cheaper generally on the market. And Red Star is slightly more expensive, but it's got a higher kale parentage, which is why I'm mentioning the varieties here. So you've got slightly better winter hardiness with the Red Star, and also because of the kale, you get a bit more regrowth as well. So that's one for me to utilise maybe after Christmas. And then interestingly, we move on to this 20-week period. And it's amazing how when we get to sort of early mid-August, we still get a lot of conversations where people are thinking of putting in these species that need 20 weeks rather than the 10 to 12 weeks, things like kale. And of course, it's too late and we don't get the proper crop we're looking for. So you've got to be careful. These sort of 20-week species would normally go in probably around June time, maybe a little bit later, end of June, early July, but that sort of time rather than August. Main crop turnips can be really useful. Generally more winter hardy than a stubble turnip. So we had some cold weather just before Christmas last year, and we did see some stubble turnip crops suffering, and they went a bit mushy and not great. The hardy winter turnips are more hardy. They can be used later in the season. They tend to also yield a slightly higher yield than the stubble turnip as well. And interestingly, some varieties have better disease than others. So this year, with all the rain we've had and fairly mild conditions, we've seen a lot of alternaria around. Some varieties of hardy turnip can be better or worse at disease resistance for alternaria. So again, obviously we can't predict the future, but just think about that when we're utilising some of these species. So the true kale, again, people have probably dealt with this over the years. Good protein, 17, 18%. Again, it's got that 20-week establishment period. So just be mindful it can't go in too late in the autumn. And as you can see, as we go along, the yield of some of these species are creeping up as well. So a good crop of kale could give us 9 tonnes a hectare dry matter. Very winter hardy can be really useful for using later in the season. So maybe end of January, February time, tends to stand pretty well, thick stems, even if we have some snow in further northern conditions or districts. Kale is slow out the blocks, and it's had a bit of a hammering from flea beetle, especially as a treated seed was banned a few years ago. So just be really careful in the first 6 weeks of establishment with flea beetle, with kale. Sorry, flea beetle can knock it around. Of course, we can still spray for flea beetle at this point, but it's certainly worth monitoring. If we start to see those small pinpricks or the shot holing on the leaf, that's what the issue is, and we probably need to intervene there to get it past that stage. Once it's up and running, it's normally pretty good. Okay, and then just another couple of the longer term forage options, which probably slightly more specialist, if anything. Swedes, we do deal with a fair bit. Lower protein, interestingly, and they still have that 20-week growth period, so they've got to go in reasonably early, but they have much higher energy, so that can be really useful. And again, that yield potential is creeping up, so 8.5 tonnes a hectare. Tend to suit wetter climates, so I would say they are growing better over in the southwest maybe, and again utilised later in the winter because of that winter hardiness. And then fodder beet, again, probably quite a specialist species, tends to need to be precision drilled to give those beets the optimum space to get some really good yields. And you can see suddenly the yield potential 14 tonnes a hectare. A minute ago, we were talking about stubble turnips at 4.5. But again, they need that 20-week period, and they've got high energy, which can also be useful. We are seeing an increase actually in people, rather than just lifting and feeding the beet, grazing it in situ. And again, just be aware some species are better at this than others. We've had a variety for a while now called felled hare, and that has a low dry matter, meaning it sits a little bit higher out of the ground so the stock can get to it. It's about 50% above the ground. Most of the lifting varieties sit lower, and again, the stock can't really get to it then. Okay, so that's our sort of main short-term brassica forage options or similar species. I think if we're looking for anything to go into the following year, we're probably looking at more perennial short-term grasses. These could be things like Westerwald or Italian ryegrass. Of course, they can be grazed over the winter and they'll recover, which is really useful. And they have a really long planting window, so they could be planted anytime from spring all the way through till probably early mid-September, even a bit later if needed. As we know, grasses on their own aren't particularly high in protein, so you could think about adding a legume species into these mixes. Things like vetches or tares can be really handy at boosting the protein. Crimson clover was used down on the sort of south really, as an old-fashioned overwinter sheep keep, but we still use it quite a bit today as an annual clover, so that lasts about 6 or 8 months and then fades away. Interestingly as well, we see an increase in people using berseem clover, so another annual clover, but this one isn't winter hardy. So again, just be careful if we are thinking of adding some of these clovers. They're not all cut from exactly the same cloth. Most recently, we've been experimenting with a sort of third annual clover called balancer clover. Again, that's a winter hardy annual, so that could be a really useful one to add into a Westerwald or Italian ley if it needs to go over the winter. Most grasses can generally be grazed, we know that, but again, later on, as they start to bolt into the spring, these short-term Westerwolds and Italians can be tricky to graze well because they do get very stemmy and very upright. So just be mindful of that. Although they are generally the more economic or cheaper end of the scale, they can get quite stemmy and lose their quality quite quickly as we head into the following season. We're seeing an increase more and more in cover crops in general, and of course that does also give us some grazing opportunities, hopefully. There's a few species I just want to bring into our attention. The first one is a non-winter hardy species that can look really good at this time of year. So we've had a pretty mild autumn so far. Things like mustards, radishes, phacelias, spring cereals, and black oats as well, which also behave a bit like a spring cereal. They can look really good in October, but actually, as we get some colder weather towards Christmas, they can start to get knocked around pretty quickly. So you might look at a field now and think, brilliant, yeah, that's ready for some nice clean grazing just after Christmas, and come back at the end of December and it's all dying away. So just be mindful of that, especially the black oats. Again, they behave like spring cereals, similar to spring cereal volunteers you might see at the moment, looking pretty green. As we get into December, they will fade away pretty rapidly. Buckwheat's a really interesting one. We are using that in quite a few mixes at the moment. It's pretty reliable and it doesn't sort of antagonize too many other species in our mixtures, in our rotations. However, with sheep especially, we can see some issues as a skin irritant. So phagopyrism can affect the skin. Seems to, at the moment, especially affect breeds with white faces. So white pigments, texels, for example. We had a situation, I think this time last year, group of texels went down after about 3 years of grazing a fairly strong stand of buckwheat with other things in the mix, but there's probably about 40–50% buckwheat in that mixture. They look pretty unhappy, ears down, they're easy to catch, so they weren't doing well. However, after they were taken off the crop, they were put back onto some older permanent grass, given a steroid injection and some vitamin E, and they came back pretty quick, but it's just worth bearing that in mind. Interestingly, Suffolks with the black faces were grazed on the same cover crop and they didn't seem to have such an issue. So I think there is something in that, in the pigment situation there. Brassicas in cover crops, our mustards, our radishes, and of course all the forage brassicas we just talked about are generally pretty highly digestible. Cereals much higher in fibre, so situations where you might just want to get a group of used up and out the way for a while, you could look to graze on cereal rye or something that isn't too high in protein, because you don't want to put too much condition on them possibly. And interestingly, some trial data a while back now, the Organic Research Centre, they found that basically grazing these sort of non-forage brassicas, so things like turnips, mustard and radish, the sheep put on less weight than grazing things like clovers, as you sort of would expect. But again, just be mindful if you are being offered things like mustard or fodder radish, it's okay, it'll do a job. We're not going to put a lot of weight on lambs. From our experience, we found things like Phacelia and linseed, the sheep aren't particularly interested in. They'll probably graze it a bit, but again, probably not putting a lot of weight on. And we're seeing more interest as we go into next year on the SFI side of things. There's a couple of options for cover crops, one being SAM2, a winter cover crop, I think this could be an interesting opportunity for sheep farmers. But again, maybe just question, if you are taking on land from maybe an arable neighbour, what's gone into the cover crop mix, and what's, if it's going to be any use to you. Again, if it's all dead by January and that's when you can get onto it, that might not be so useful. Okay, so just to look at a few of those species we mentioned, and just to pull them apart a little bit. So on the left-hand side with the purple flowers, that's a vetch or tares, as we used to call them in the old days. A winter hardy, high protein legume, so similar to peas, really, that sort of sprawling habit. And that can be a really nice addition to some of these cover crops. So just thinking about some species we might include in our winter cover crops if we get the choice. It will last the winter. There are some non-winter hardy species of vetches. So again, just ask that question of your seed supplier. But if you can get a winter hardy species, that will be there all the way through. And again, we've seen sheep really going for these high protein species when they get into a cover crop field. In the middle there is the crimson clover I mentioned earlier on. So a reasonably winter hardy annual clover. I think further in the Midlands, you might start to see it getting knocked around by the cold winter. But again, high protein can be a really useful one. The berseem clover in the middle there with the white flowers, and that is a non-winter hardy annual clover. We're seeing the berseem being used quite a lot in oilseed rape companions. And again, it's naturally dying away as we get into sort of November and probably early December. If we're thinking of grazing a mix with berseem in it around Christmas, it might not be there reliably. But interestingly, there's more slightly newer species of balancer clover, which is a winter hardy annual. That could be one to think about adding into some of these mixes. The middle one there is a grass, really. I'm thinking probably Westwold or Italian. That could go in. They're not going to get a chance to head, really, if they go in probably mid-end of August. So that's fine in terms of the Westwold seeding or causing any issues in an arable rotation. But we know they're winter hardy, which is good. And of course, they will regrow after grazing. So if we are to give that field a rest, you might get a second go later in the winter. And of course, then if it is a strong stand of Italian or Westwold, it could be left into early spring, maybe if we're going into maize and having a cut taken off it. Surprising actually how you don't need a lot of grass in a mix to really show it. So I was looking at a mix near Staffordshire a few weeks ago, and he probably had about between 3.5 to 5 kilos of Italian in a cover crop mix, and that gave him pretty much a carpet of Italian. So it gave him a really good sort of winter hardy base to a cover mix. And then apologies for the slightly different illustration, but that is to signify a spring cereal, as we said, not winter hardy, and that could be a spring volunteer as well from the previous crop. Just be careful, that will die away around Christmas time. Again, the black oat can look really good at this time of year, loads of vegetation, loads of biomass. He's not winter hardy, he'll fade off. The one on the end is a cereal rye, or signifying probably a winter cereal in general, so that can be another useful component to a cover crop, or again just keeping some use up out the way. Things like winter oats could be handy. Cereal rye, again, we know starts to grow really early in the spring as well, so that could be a useful one. Just a few more species to consider. The buckwheat, non-winter hardy. Any sort of cold weather, it starts to look pretty unhappy. We had a frost a week or two ago here, just outside Cheltenham, and the buckwheat, which was being used as a companion for oilseed rape, started to look a little bit unhappy. And just be mindful of that phagopyrism issue if it's a strong stand of buckwheat. I think you'd probably get away with grazing buckwheat that started to die away more so than when it's really green and healthy earlier in the season. But again, just be mindful. Interestingly, buckwheat does have this affinity with phosphate in the soil. So certainly on these high alkaline soils that I'm on, the brash, with high pH, it can unlock phosphate in the soil by being slightly acidic around that root zone, is what we think it is. So that can help to bring phosphate and make it available to the following crop. So you might see some of these cover crops with a fair amount of buckwheat in them, if that's what the arable guys are sort of lacking, really. Tillage radish looks like a big annual parsnip. It can get killed off by a few frosts, but again, it certainly can be grazed, no problem at all. And it's quite a popular one for compaction busting and that sort of thing. Phacelia can be a useful one. It's, in terms of a cover crop species, not really related to much else in the rotation, so it's sort of independent, not antagonizing anything else. From a sheep grazing point of view, there are some and some, really. I've seen them walk past it quite a lot, but it's fairly reliable. It's a small seed, you don't need much of it. generally, again, if it goes in as a half decent plant going into the winter, it gets killed off by some decent frost. The mustard we've talked about, pretty cheap and cheerful, great for late sowings, but again, I wouldn't rely on it after Christmas, especially in sort of Midlands and further north, but it's a pretty reliable one. And then the fodder radish, similar to mustard, tends to be a little bit bigger plant, bit better rooting, and a little bit more winter hardy, but again, tends to fade away between Christmas and New Year, so not one to be totally relied upon. If you're thinking of concocting or having a bit of an influence on what cover crops are being sown, you might give the arable guy a nudge and say, look, can we get some stubble turnips in there? A pinch of stubble turnips will go a long way in a cover crop to give you something useful to graze. Similarly, forage rape is great. Hybrid rape kale, again, small seeds, 0.25, half a kilo an acre or less of that, and you'll certainly see it in the mixture. Kale's a bit tricky. We know it needs that longer window to establish, so it probably wouldn't suit some of these winter cover crops or autumn sown cover crops quite so well. Okay, and just a couple more to finish off. I think we're just about in time. Just a nice example there of a non-winter hardy Persian clover or Berseem clover on the left-hand side, and then Alsite clover, which is a bit like red clover in a way, a completely winter hardy species. A stark difference there in probably end of December, January time. So again, if you would put money down to graze the one on the left in January, you might not be very happy if you get there, and that's what it looks like. Just to finish off then, longer term opportunities. We're seeing more and more interest in the SFI scheme, I think, as the payments have gone up in the last few months. Within that, one popular option is the SAM3 option. So this is effectively a diverse mix or a herbal ley. And this can be sown for 3 years, and it can be a really useful opportunity, I think, whether it be arable guys bringing this on as a break in the arable rotation. It can grow a lot of stuff, a lot of biomass. It's going to have something done with it. So grazing would be my preference. Just be mindful, if we are grazing herbal leys, they've got not so much delicate species, but species that grow from a crown above the ground. If those crowns are overgrazed, we can lose them quite quickly, and we're back to a sort of grassy mix that isn't very exciting. So just trying to avoid overgrazing herbal leys, really. And there's a lot of exclamation marks there just to make that point. A few key species in these diverse mixes, these herbal leys. Plantain is a really useful one. Packed full of minerals and nutrients from a health point of view, especially selenium. If you're lacking that, can be a way of boosting selenium for the stock. Chicory can be a bit of a love-hate one with sheep. It's got twice the amount of minerals than a ryegrass plant. So again, when we're thinking about grazing pure ryegrass swards, we can see where these mineral deficiencies can come from. And if we are including species like plantain and chicory, which the Kiwis have been doing for a long time, we can bring those minerals to the animal. But the chicory especially does bolt. It can make it difficult to manage. So in about end of June, early July, we get a long green stem, which they'll still eat. But as the season goes on, that can get quite woody. And that can be a problem in terms of managing it. So fencing in and around that can be difficult. And actually, friends of mine have said when they're trying to shepherd ewes and lambs in a sort of forest of chicory, it can be difficult to see them as well. So maybe just question whether chicory needs to be in the mix or not. I like it personally, very deep-rooted and anthelmintic properties as well, so anti-worming properties, but it can make the shepherding a bit tricky. Red clover, I don't want to go into too much tonight. There's people on here who know a lot more of it about it than me, but there seems to be a little bit of evidence at the moment that there's possibly less risk concerning estrogen than we thought with red clover swards or swards that are heavy in red clover. But I believe the work that's been done recently was on a mixed sward herbal type ley with lots of different things rather than a red clover ley. I would like to see a few more papers saying the same thing, that we don't need to worry about the red clover maybe as much before I start to not be cautious about it, that's for sure. Samfoin and bird's-foot trefoil are interesting species. They both have a tannin content, which is what we see in wine and tea, and it's this that has the anthelmintic properties that can reduce the worm burden, especially in ewes and lambs. So that could be a really useful inclusion to these more diverse mixes. More and more, to be fair, as we're looking at these herbal leys, no one size fits all. So we're tweaking these mixes for what they're going to be used for. So is it grazing? Is it cutting? Is it sheep? Is it cattle? And soil type as well. Some species don't do so well on the heavier land. Some really suit the lighter land. So again, we're really trying to make these mixes and these options, this SAM3, SFI, suit the end result as much as possible. Okay, I think I'm just about in time, so that's me done. I'll say thank you very much for listening, and any questions, or we can do some questions at a later date.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sam. We have had a few questions come in. I think one of them, Neris's question, you've just answered about the, she was inquiring about the red clover post and pre-tupping. And maybe Kate might touch on that as well, possibly when she speaks next. We had another.
I feel slightly underqualified to go into it in too much detail, and I'm sure the guys who did the most recent study would probably have something to say with it as well. But I'm still cautious because I think I have to be. Yeah.
Okay. We had another question come in. Which brassicas are better for acid soils? And I was also going to add to that and say, does the soil types affect these winter forage crops, what you can and can't grow?
Yeah, good question. I think probably some of the forage rapes and hybrid rape kales would be okay on the more acidic soils. If you can still get some lime on there, it would help, that's for sure. Probably more of an issue is the very dry soils. We tend to find that the brassicas can bolt quite quickly if they have a dry time. Quality drops quite quickly as well. So maybe looking at some deeper rooting species in there as well as the brassicas. Possibly that's where the clovers, the annual clovers, might come in, for argument's sake.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And we've got another question from Kevin. With the demise of the single farm payment, regulatory wise, if you were wanting to reseed or improve permanent pasture, is it okay to put a root crop or brassica in between reseeding?
Yes, yeah, and I think more so than ever, we're seeing issues with the wireworm leather jackets, so grassland pests, where people are ploughing up and going almost straight back in with the grass, and that can be quite a mess at times. So I think the bigger gap you can give it with a non-host crop, which would probably be the brassicas. A cereal's okay, but it's still a grass at the end of the day, would be good. So try and plan ahead of time is the key thing to allow you to have that gap before you go back into the grass. I mean, we've had a few people ploughing some land up that they knew had been grass for a very long time, and we've ended up putting a double break in of turnips over the winter, going to drill in the spring, finding a lot of wireworm still, and then going in with a sort of leafy turnip forage rake mix to get us back to the following autumn. So it's actually come out for a year, and then we had success. But I think going in that spring would have been a mistake.
Okay, thank you. And I just had another quick question I'd like to ask about grazing new lays. How would you advise the grass lays people to graze them that first time they put the sheep out on them to get the best sort of long-term benefit from the grass?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on what we're grazing. If it's a grass only sort of ryegrassy type lay, you can probably be a little bit harder on it if you have to be than some of the more diverse mixes. But I think that early graze is worth it to get things tillering, definitely, whether it be a grass mix or if you've got a more herbal type lay, things like the chicory can push on quite early and almost sort of out, not smother, but out compete things. So that early graze after about probably 8 weeks or so, but you would ideally keep them moving across it and keep off it once you graze that area, back fence it, and then keep moving across so that you're allowing the stuff to recover and not grazing it too hard early on.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I think that's all the questions for now. If we get any more, we'll come back to you after Kate. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So I'd now like to introduce our second speaker of the evening, which is Kate Phillips. Kate is an independent sheep consultant from Shropshire with a specialist interest in ruminant nutrition. Kate spent 30 years working for ADAS as a nutritionist and sheep specialist before setting up her own consultancy in 2014. Kate also lectured part-time at Harper Adams for 6 years. She now works on a variety of projects supporting knowledge transfer to farmers and vets, and is currently focused on a project to breed low methane sheep. So over to you, Kate. You ready?
Thank you, Susie. Just going to share my screen. Just a minute. Sorry. A minute. Back to the beginning. Are we okay, Susie?
Yeah, that's all good. can
Has
see
it
it.
come up as a full screen yet?
No, that has, yeah.
Is now, yeah.
It has now. Great, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you to the Southeast NSA for inviting me to speak. I'm not sure I got the best slot of the week. I'm sure everybody's pretty tired from attending lots of other things all week. But anyway, most of you, or those who do know me, will know me largely as a nutritionist and sheep specialist, and that's the angle I'm coming from tonight in terms of nutrition. We were talking about delivering the annual feed budget for sheep. It's very difficult to actually cover that in 25 minutes, so I'm going to do my best. But what I'm going to be telling you tonight, I hope I'm going to really influence or emphasize, should I say, how very important nutrition is. It's a key influence on flock efficiency, alongside health and genetics, of course. But if we have really good nutrition, we have better immunity, we have better health, and we have higher production. So I'm going to walk through what the ewe needs in terms of dry matter, energy, and protein. I've been asked specifically to focus on forages, as that is the way the industry's going. We're trying to grow more and more of the feed for our sheep on farm and buy less in. And everybody is relying much more on grass and alternative forages, as Sam has described. So I'm going to just pick on one or two different crops and talk about those specifically. I can't possibly cover the range that Sam has mentioned, and he's the expert in terms of the wide range that's available to you. And of course, we always have to recognise that there will be times when we do need to supplement animals, and I'll mention that as we go along. So just, this is fundamental, and many of you will have seen this slide of mine before, but, grazed grass forage is the cheapest way to feed animals. So we're talking about 8 pence a kilogram of dry matter and maybe only half a penny a megajoule of energy. If we make it into silage, we've actually double the cost of that, making it, more than double. So the plastic, the machinery, everything that's required to actually make that silage makes that a much more expensive feed than the original grazed forage. If we look at the cereals this year, they're cheaper than they were, thank goodness, but they're still a lot more expensive than any forage product. And then we move on to compound feeds. We know they're going to be a bit cheaper this winter, but they're still very expensive compared to what we can grow at home. So we're talking about 41 pence a kilo of dry matter compared to 8 pence potentially for grazed grass and forage crops. So what we're all trying to do, I'm sure every single one of you out there, is trying to make the best use of the cheapest feeds on the farm, the ones you've grown yourself, and improve your grassland utilisation. Through recent years, we've had a big push on improving the amount of grass we grow, how we graze it rotationally, preferably to actually increase yields, and actually get much more from what we've got at home. And it's much better, as all of you know, to move the sheep to the feed rather than be carrying the feed to the animals, economising in fuel and labour time. And of course, only feeding supplements when we really need them. So the vital thing from my perspective as well is that we need to feed that rumen for optimum fermentation. So whatever the food stuff, you tell me the feed nutrient sort of content of a feed, and I can make a diet for you as long as it's digestible enough and going to meet the sort of digestibility that we need for the stage of production a sheep is at. So balancing the rumen is really important, and that will come into play in a bit later in my talk when we talk about balancing root and leaf when we're talking about grazing root crops. So very simply put, graze grass first. Any conserved forage, is next most expensive, moving on to barley and straights and then compound feeds. So trying to put the balance of energy requirements into the forage area of our diets. So just to sort of point out to you in terms of what the ewe needs, I use a very standard ewe of 70 kilograms whenever I'm doing my calculations, but I do appreciate some of you have got 40 kilo ewes and some of you got 100 kilo ewes. This girl is somewhere in between. And I just wanted to give you a few sort of rules of thumb in terms of energy required. So if we're talking about maintenance for a ewe, we're talking about, for a 70 kilo ewe, a rough rule of thumb would be 10% of body weight plus 1.8 8 megajoules. So we're talking about somewhere like 8.8 megajoules per day for a ewe just be walking, breathing, digesting, doing her normal bodily functions without being pregnant or lactating. In late pregnancy, we virtually double the amount of energy that ewe requires. So, you know, that is a big shift in energy requirement. But as you can see in my table, when we actually get to lactation, early lactation, we then get something like 3.5 times maintenance requirements when we've really got to have plenty of high quality forage in front of our sheep to actually make them milk well and grow their lambs well. And energy is the most important part of any feed budget. So we're actually budgeting to energy and, of course, to dry matter intake. So we're trying to fit the energy required by the animals into the appetite, the potential dry matter intake of that ewe on any particular day in her life. We also have standards for protein, and we talk about metabolizable protein in sheep. And maintenance, we need about 90 grams of metabolizable protein. And this, just a rough rule of thumb, would be 70 kilos plus 20 gives us the 90, etc. down the line. But just showing you how much the protein requirements do increase quite dramatically for early lactation and late pregnancy. So as I said before, we're trying to get a good balance of rumen degradable protein and fermentable energy in the rumen to achieve the metabolizable protein that we really need to meet the animal's demands and optimize production. So working out diets, how much can a sheep eat? It's really important to have some estimate of that before we can actually put a diet together. We've got to know roughly how much she's going to eat of it and how many megajoules of energy that's going to deliver to her that day. So we need to predict the dry matter intake, and these are fairly standard figures used across the industry. As a dry post-weaning early mid-pregnancy ewe would eat about 1.5 to maybe 2% of her body weight. So roughly in dry matter terms, that's about 1 kilo. So that is, you know, a very straightforward measure for us to think for this size of ewe. In late pregnancy, her appetite increases and she can eat somewhere between 2 and 2.5% of her body weight, or roughly, let's say, 1.5 kilograms of dry matter per day. And in early lactation, once she's shipped the lambs out and has no limits on rumen capacity, she can actually eat more like 2.5 kilograms of dry matter per day. So very big shifts in how much dry matter we need to be providing at different times of the year for our sheep. And I did this rough calculation. I'm sorry, it's just a lot on one screen, but I thought I'd just walk through and think how many megajoules of energy and how much dry matter we would need to feed a twin-bearing ewe for a year. Okay, so I looked at her dry period between October and end of January before her energy requirements start going up before late pregnancy. I then looked at the 1st of February to the 31st of March before she lambs in terms of what on average she might need per day. I then looked at lactation for twin lambs growing. I then looked at the dry recovering phase when she's probably having to put on a body condition score, or in her in terms of body weight, that would be somewhere like 10 to 13 kilograms of body weight. No, sorry, about 10 kilograms of body weight, sorry. And then I looked at the lambs, what they would need. So we've got twin lambs, all sold by 20 weeks. So they're roughly on the farm for 180 days and the megajoules they would require. So I've come to a total of about 10,000, just over 10,000 megajoules. And if you look at that in equivalent dry matter terms, that would be roughly 1 ton of dry matter of 11 megajoules per kilogram dry matter grass. So just gives you a rough guide of what you would need for one ewe rearing 2 lambs, okay? And of course, you'd have to have a small allowance for rams and replacements. But I thought that was quite an interesting way to look at it. 10,000, nearly 11,000 megajoules, about a ton of dry matter for that ewe and her 2 lambs. So Sam was talking about filling the gap earlier on this evening, and how we need to identify where the grass supply curve is dipping below the livestock feed demand. And this is a graph I pinched from one of the AHDB booklets. But what we need to do when supply exceeds demand, we need to conserve forage or build a forage wedge for later in the season. Or if actually we are short of forage, do we need to grow one of the crops that Sam was mentioning, or do we need to bring in supplements? And of course, I think probably the answer already is that we try to fill the gap with alternative forages if we can, if we've got suitable land for growing them. So how do we measure dry matter supply? Lots of you out there, I guess, are measuring grass with a sward stick or a plate meter. There are some more sophisticated methods these days, but I'm not sure how reliable they are at this stage. And then we try to estimate the dry matter of the crop according to the time of year, and we work out kilograms of dry matter per hectare. The root crops and brassicas, it's a little bit different. We would probably throw out a quadrat and measure and weigh, cut that amount of crop, weigh it and take an average of that, multiply by 10,000, and we'd come up with and multiply by the dry matter of the crop, and we'd come up with a tons of dry matter per hectare. So that would give us an estimation of the tons of dry matter that we can allocate to the flock as we see fit. With root crops and brassicas, we only ever assume that they're going to eat about 70% of their diet from roots and brassicas, and we would provide some dry and long forage and a grass run back if at all possible. And many of you, I don't know if you do look at these, but Grass Check GB is something that is available across the country. I get weekly bulletins through the growing season, and we get a picture of how grass is growing across the country. This is based on about 50 farms across Great Britain, and you can see the yellow line, everybody, the beef and sheep farms, and the dotted line is the 4-year average for grass production. And you can see typically we have a dip, and this year we had a serious dip in June when it got very hot and dry, and that fell well below the 4-year average of grass production. But we have, to a certain extent, recovered that in the rainy weather of July, August, and a little bit warmer in September. But you can see what we mean when we've got large bulk growth in the springtime and a bit of a kick up in the autumn, late summer, autumn. But we usually have a drop in midsummer where we may be having to think about stocking and how we're feeding our animals. Are we having to get rid of lambs early because we've run out of forage for the ewes and we've got competition between the animals, or are we able to put in a crop that's going to fill that forage gap? And just to remind you about the data that comes out of Grass Check GB, this was last week, 16th of October, and it was really heartening to see that the energy is still at 10.9 megajoules per kilogram dry matter, and the protein is still at 20. And some of you may be seeing that with rather dirty back ends on some ewes and lambs. But just to remind you, that's there to help you think about dry matter of your grass at any particular time of the year, and also the energy and the protein content of that grass too. And I just wanted to say something. I was listening to Tuesday night to the people on the Measure to Manage element of this conference, and something that Duncan Nellis actually said that evening was, don't waste dry matter on low performing animals. And he is very keen on recording data on his large flock of Clin ewes up in Northumberland, and is very keen to pull out the ones who don't pull their weight. So it's a key point I remembered from what Duncan said. We need to get rid of the inefficient ewes that are using dry matter that could be better used on more productive animals. So the inefficient ewes are those with poor lamb growth rate. And if you've got records, which Duncan and Lawrence had on Tuesday evening, you can identify those ewes and pull off the bottom performing animals in your flock and make that dry matter work for other more productive animals. So Sam has done a really good sort of coverage of the range of forages available to you, and I'm just going to home in on one or two. He did mention most of them. I'm not going to put a lot of detail onto these. I'm going to leave that to him, and he's the expert on different varieties and selections of mixes. But that's the choice we have: grass and white clover, red clover and perennial ryegrass. Herbal lays, very, very popular now, as trying to actually improve soil quality and soil health, and getting a good horizon of root depths within the soil. Roots and brassicas, cover crops, which I'm not really going to touch on, but obviously they're available to some of us, depending where we're farming. And of course, winter cereals. I heard somebody recently say he'd been offered 500 acres of winter cereals, so he was delighted to be putting his sheep on those for a good part of the winter. Just to come to the herbal lays, we're aiming to improve soils, reduce nitrogen uses, improve drought tolerance, animal performance, and lift yield if we can. I'm anecdotally hearing from all sorts of people, and as Sam alluded to, some of the plants within the herbal lays don't always work on everybody's farm, and it does seem you've got to suck it and see a little bit to see what actually fits on your farm. Of course, the payments from SFI and something like £382 a hectare for the GS4 legume and herb rich seed mixture make it fairly appealing. But I just wanted to tell you about one of the trials that has been really well, not very recently, but 2-3 years ago now, from a group in Dublin, looking at comparing perennial ryegrass with perennial ryegrass and white clover, with 6 and 9 species herbal lays over 2 grazing seasons. They did find that lambs grew faster on the mixes rather than the perennial ryegrass only. The ewes were heavier and had higher body condition score on the herbal lays. The lambs on the perennial ryegrass took more days to slaughter, but one of the main benefits that was seen on these 2 years of work was the lambs wormed less on the herbal lays, 1.5 times roughly for the herbal lays compared to 2.7 or over 2 twice for the other lays. So really valuable if you're on a farm where there's anthelmintic resistance and you're thinking you need to do something in terms of management, you may be looking to herbal lays to help you. That has been backed up by some work on some farms in Wales through Farming Connect. And they found similar growth rate on the two, the comparison, the high herbal lays and the conventional pastures, but lower feck and longer time between drenches. So confirmed on various other trials too. But what we're thinking, as Sam alluded to, condensed tannins in some of the plants within the mixes, improved protein utilization and better trace element supply seem to be the reasons why we're getting the anthelmintic, the help in terms of reducing anthelmintic usage. So suck it and see. I think it's a fairly, it's not early days. Quite a lot of people have tried these, but listening to a few YouTube videos from dairy farmers and other farmers across the UK, it is a sort of find what works for you and get the best mix that will work on your farm. A question came into the question box earlier about red clover, and I just thought I'd let you know or see some of the results that have come out on red clover in recent years. We find it an excellent feed for finishing lambs, but obviously there are estrogens in some of the red clovers, and you can get some udder development if you've got a high estrogen level in red clover, but there are lower estrogen varieties available now. It's certainly a good way to grow protein with added benefit of lots of nitrogen fixation. And certainly the work I did at Harper Adams some years ago now really did show that red clover silage is a brilliant feed for sheep. They absolutely love it, and there is very, very little need for supplements. And I certainly know 1 or 2 organic farmers who are feeding only red clover silage in the run-up to lambing. The red clover is drought tolerant, so often if we've got a very dry period, the grass has stopped growing, but the red clover is still moving on. There are these fears of reduced youth fertility from phytoestrogens, but it does appear that the original work was done in New Zealand, Australia, in Australia mainly, and the animals were on almost pure red clover over a long period of time, and that does seem to have a bigger effect than we ever see here. And as I say, there are some varieties that are low in estrogen, but I would say on the whole, red clover and perennial ryegrass mixes, I'm not saying pure stands of red clover, seem to be a very good feed for grazing ewes and lambs. I just want to tell you about the innovative farmers field trial that was done in 2021. This was run by Gillian Preece of ADAS, and she found 4 commercial farmers who were comparing swards with no red clover with those containing red clover, and it was basically red clover sown about 10% of the mix, but when they measured it in terms of the fresh grass, there was something like on average about 18% red clover in the sward, ranging between the farms from 9 to nearly 40%. The ewes were put on the red clover from 3 weeks before tupping to the end of mating, and ewes were the red clover and herbal ley covers were higher than the grass covers at the start. So it does suggest that they maybe the ewes on those leys actually had a higher energy intake, or potentially. On 3 out of the 4 farms, scanning was better when red clover was included, and the average was 170% for the swards without red clover, and it was 181 when red clover was included. So it suggests there was no negative effect of the red clover at the levels that were indicated in this trial. We haven't looked at any higher levels than this 37% on one of these farms. And I sort of agree with Sam that maybe we do need to do a bit more investigation of other swards with different amounts of red clover in them. But this looks very promising for anybody who's got a small amount of red clover, not to be worried about it going into tupping. So no negative effect on fertility on these 4 farms. So please do look at the innovative farmers field trials. There's quite a lot of other work there on different forages. One I picked up that Liz Jenner has been doing is on lucerne recently. So just to sort of emphasize that bit about lucerne, this was actually some work Liz was doing over in Norfolk, I think, and obviously a very deep rooting plant, which, is very drought tolerant, a lot of protein, a good amount of energy, very good for rotational grazing, but graze for 7 to 10 days and then give it a 6-week rest, which is really important that the new buds aren't eaten before you take the animals out. You can expect something like 12 tonnes of dry matter a hectare, but very important to have salt available. And the key thing with lucerne is a very, very careful transition onto the crop, because we can get issues with bloat and red cut. This is just to remind you, Sam said some of this within what he was saying in terms of energy and protein content of different root crops. The root crops all tend to be pretty high energy, the brassicas not as high, but fodder beet, stubble turnips, Swedes all tend to be high because they contain an awful lot of sugar. So that's, where the energy is coming from. This is something I just took from ASDB again, looking at the sort of potential for grazing on stubble turnips, for instance, or a forage brassica. We had a yield in August of 4 tonnes a hectare. We can work out just by knowing the daily dry matter intake of the animals, how many grazing days we can work out for that particular crop. And likewise, which remember, as animals grow, they will need more. So we go from a daily requirement of 1.3 kilos per day for a 33 kilogram lamb up to 1.6 for a 39 kilogram lamb. So just easy. Once you know what you need for the animal, then you can work out how many grazing days you've got on a particular area of a crop. Just a reminder about brassicas, sometimes we can get poisoning through brassicas. So there are various risks, but most of the risks can be averted by very gradual introduction to the crops. So we have nitrate concentrations above 2 grams can be a risk. nitrate's converted into nitrate in the rumen, and it reacts with hemoglobin and stops the blood basically carrying oxygen, so we can get sudden deaths. There are also issues with photosensitization as well, and sometimes it means that some lambs have to be brought off the crop because they just don't cope with it. But I remember somebody telling me, as a seed salesperson, saying brilliant crops for finishing lambs, but there's always a small number that can't handle some of the poisoning principles within brassicas. So really, really important to be transitioning animals onto new crops very steadily. There's one that has gained lots and lots of interest of late is fodder beet. We hear an awful lot more people grazing in situ. It's one of the highest yielding crops we've got available to us. But really important to remember that it's made up of two parts. 75% is bulb, and that's where the sugar and the water are. 25% are tops, and that's the protein and the minerals. So if leaves are sparse, animals may well need extra protein to supplement. So that's because we're getting a largely sugar diet with very little protein going in if we just got the bulbs, and we've got to add some additional protein in some way, either by providing a grazing or grass run back or some other means of getting some protein into them. So transition onto the crop is important, should be done over several days, but sheep are good at regulating their own intake. When we've got them behind a fence and we're strip grazing, we need about 0.3 of a metre per animal, because the access, so they can actually all get their fair share of that strip, is as important as the allocation given in the day. 2-day shifts are the best with sheep because we need a balance, as I said again, of balance of bulb and leaf. And always remember that actually sheep aren't very good at digging down into the bottom of the root and often leave some tail in the bottom. So the proportion of root to top is usually a bit higher than it would have been if they'd eaten the whole plant. Always good practice with any root crop to have a headland, a dry lying area for the animals to get off if grazing conditions are poor. So just finally, just my final, I think I'm just coming up to how much time I should, when I should finish. Transitioning to a new feed on all of these things is really important. One of the things I would always say is don't change a ewe's diet in the first 5 weeks of pregnancy. Otherwise, you are going to get some potential loss of embryos. So try to keep her diet as stable as possible and always change gradually. So allow, ideally, a couple of hours access to the new crop each day and build up over a week or two. Allow a grass run back and dry silage or hay and water. Strip graze to keep that balance of nutrients. So you're not just letting, if you just open the gate, they'll all run in and eat all the leaves and come back and maybe eat the roots. So really important to, and that is because of keeping that rumen happy, keeping that rumen degradable protein going in, as well as the fermentable energy from the sugar in the roots. And the important thing on any crop, really, if you've identified trace element problems, then really important, but particularly on roots, we need extra copper, selenium and iodine. And just a final mention about trace elements, lots of products on the market, and I'm not advertising these three, it's just those 3 photos I happen to have. But on predominantly forage diets, trace elements could be deficient, depending on underlying soils, grass and forage types. And just a few things to remind you, deficiency of cobalt has been shown to impair embryo development, and everybody knows that lambs are very sensitive to cobalt deficiency and end up not growing if they don't have daily cobalt. Low selenium and vitamin E have been shown to increase embryo loss at implantation, and of course loss of selenium, we get reduced immunity. And lack of iodine can lead to stillbirths and poor lamb growth later in the season. So really important to get a diagnosis of any problem. Assume on root crops you're going to need some supplements, but in the grazing grass situation, you need to identify before you start giving too many different supplements, provide the ones you actually need. So final slide, just to summarize, Work out energy and dry matter needs of your stock and think where you've got shortfalls in your typical year. I know no year is typical. Everyone seems to be quite different these days. But trying to identify where the gaps are. Think of the crops you could fill those gaps with. You may change your grazing management, but always have some contingency plans in terms of silage and hay, should we need them. Just stocking. That may be getting unproductive animals off the farm, selling lambs early, taking more animals in to actually eat surplus, and consider break crops to supply extra nutrition, change diets really gradually to make sure we don't get any digestive upsets, and supplement when needed based on forage quality and supply. So we're all well aware that we need to supplement hay and silage diets through the winter unless we've got exceptional quality. So that just comes in, yeah, as an extra, really. I'm not focusing on that this evening. Anyway, and I think probably, and Sam would probably agree with me, consider experimenting with new forages to improve homegrown energy and protein production, aiming to reduce the purchase of, concentrate feeds. Thank you, everybody. Hope I've timed it well.
Thank you, Kate. That was fantastic. Good timing as well. And we've got some questions coming for you. There's one from Clive Phillips, who says, in terms of land use, how does cost of forage compare to, say, barley given as dry matter on a barley per hectare is presumably much higher than a grass dry matter per hectare?
Sorry, could you answer to tell me again, please, Susie? I'm just trying to get myself back onto the screen. I don't know where I stopped sharing. That's what I need to do, isn't it? Sorry. Right. Okay. Sorry. Could you tell me again? I was just focusing on my screen.
So Clive's asked, in terms of land use, how does cost of forage compare to, say, barley given dry matter on a barley per hectare? Barley per hectare is presumably much higher than grass dry matter per hectare.
Yeah, I mean, how I based those costs at the beginning was on a kilo of barley costing at the market price compared to what we've worked out what a kilo of dry matter of grass would cost us to grow, basically, Susie. So I haven't got those figures, Clive, I'm sorry, but I think it would just be the same unless you're making a very big margin on your barley, which I don't think many people are. So yeah, it'd be interesting to work that out, but I have not got that at my fingertips, Clive. I'm sorry.
No problem. We've got another.
And I stick my oar in here, Susie, but just thinking about that because I read the question before you got to it.
Yeah, I probably needed more time. Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about 10 tonne per hectare grass dry matter,
yeah,
you've got to go some to get a 10 tonne per hectare yield of barley, and that's dry matter. I know there are some clever people who are getting more than 10 tonnes, but that's at 85% dry matter, so you're only getting 8.5 tonnes, if you like.
Yeah,
that's me being a grassland enthusiast, you see, trying to.
Yeah. Well, actually, interestingly, we don't seem to get 10 tonnes of dry matter on grass on average, Jan.
Oh no, nor they do without barley either.
Yeah, no, we don't. No, we don't. I still think grass would be cheaper, Clive, but by quite a long chalk, yeah.
And you can't feed straight barley to sheep either.
Oh, don't quite agree.
Whereas you can with grass.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to just feed barley. You could feed barley whole to sheep.
No, I mean just barley, as it were. It would still be expensive.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, Susie, I couldn't resist that.
Sorry.
No, okay. It's a more concise answer, so that's fine. We got another question come in from Abby Cook. If we are supplementing sheep with trace elements, what is the best to use, i.e. drenches, boluses, etc.? And what should we be looking for in a good quality product when purchasing it and using it?
Well, that's a very big question. There are so many products on the market. It's a minefield to choose the right one. We do have, like you say, the drenches, injections. We have boluses. So we have a whole range. And I think what we need to do is identify what you need on the farm I think we need to remember that some of these elements are needed every day, cobalt being the particular one. So we need a regular supply. So if it was cobalt you wanted, and that's what you're short of on the farm, you would need something that was going to provide it every day. So if you're going for a drench, if you were going for drenches, they can provide cobalt, but it doesn't last very long. So you've got to repeat drench, every 2 to 3 weeks if you really need cobalt in the diet. Or you can go for a bolus. And I think it's one of those things. I've worked with some farmers looking at different products, comparing them on their own farms, and it's not always the same one works best on each farm, on every farm. So you've almost got to find the one that works best for you. And I couldn't favour one over the other. I have done trials where the drenches have come out the best. I've come out with trials where the boluses have come out the best. So it's not an easy one to answer, I'm afraid. But all I would say is find out if you've got a problem, find the trace elements, look for a product that's got the required amount of trace element, because when you look at a list of trace element supplements, you can be easily fooled by the fact that some say they've got something in them, but some have got an awful lot more than others have in them, saying they're providing cobalt maybe, but some will have a lot more than others. So it is a bit of a minefield, but do a bit of research to find the product that suits you best, really.
Thank you. And we had a similar question come in from Finn, so hopefully that's answered his question as well. So we've got a question from Paul who says, is there any advice available for maintaining an all-grass system with only Crystallix as extra feed, lambing at grass and only grass-fed and permanent pasture?
Is there a blueprint? I know farmers who are doing it. I don't think they printed their blueprint, as it were, Susie, but there are farmers. I mean, Duncan Nellis is one up in Northumberland who is actually organic sheep and beef farmer who is not feeding supplements at all. So, and in terms of organic, he would be feeding very limited amounts of anything really, other than potentially essential trace elements. So it is absolutely possible, and believing in grass, we must believe in grass. It really can deliver, and there's plenty of farmers lambing at grass nowadays. They've got a rotation. Maybe they've got Swedes planted, and then they're using those till 3 weeks before lambing, and then they're turning their ewes out onto grass alone and lambing at grass with no supplements at all. So the systems are working, they're out there, and I guess we need to maybe find somebody for you to visit who's actually doing just that.
Yeah, and presumably then you need to really be looking after your grass lays as well if you're going to just use
Absolutely.
grass.
You need to have good grass lays that are very productive, and you need to be managing them, rotationally grazing to get the best out of them in terms of yield. And absolutely cutting when you need to, keeping grass heights appropriate. So yes, it does need very good attention to detail with your your grassland management. Absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is, which is better to have in a mix for sheep, whole or bruised barley with sugar beet and minerals at grass? I don't know, Zan.
I would say whole. If we get too much starch in the rumen and quickly, especially if you're putting it with sugar beet as well, you could get some sort of acidosis happening. So whole barley, sheep are perfectly capable of handling whole barley. So do you mean sugar beet shreds? Was that what we were talking about, rather than sugar beet roots, Susie?
Well, it just says with sugar beet and minerals at grass, so I'm assuming
right.
it's,
I imagine it's shreds, isn't it? Yeah. I would say whole. I think that's probably the best way. The only thing
typed on there now, nuts.
Sorry?
sugar beet nuts.
Sugar beet nuts, yeah. Well, I think whole. They should be able to manage them. If you get sometimes, if you're feeding a whole barley with very high quality silage, you can get quite a bit of whole grain coming through. And there is a sort of point, a break point when it's worth cracking them so you don't get the loss of the whole grains. But if you're spotting whole grains coming through on that regime that you're doing with the beet pulp, the minerals and the barley, then I would crack them. But it's just trying to keep the mix as safe as possible. If you've got beet pulp, you probably could crack it, I guess, because the beet pulp is incredibly safe and palatable feed. So it wouldn't be an issue with beet pulp, I guess. So the safety element.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That sort of answered all the questions we've got in there. I've just got another one just on I tend to give my sheep rock salt all year round. Do you think that's good to have that out there for the sheep?
I do actually. I'm a great advocate of rock salt. Rock salt tends to be a sort of a bit of a cure-all in many ways. I mean, it's actually quite good when animals have got off. I think that's a good thing. It makes them drink. It makes them actually clear their kidneys. It's a good substitute for buffers in the rumen. So salt encourages saliva production, and saliva helps to buffer acidity in the rumen. So, and sheep do seem to love it, and I've no reason why not to give it, because it is a very palatable thing and they like it, and it's certainly not doing them any harm at all. In fact, probably doing them good.
Thank you. One other question I had was, do you see much difference breed to breed of the requirements for food intake and protein intake?
That's something that really hasn't been looked at. What we tend to do is look at body weight in terms of energy requirements and protein requirements. So we tend just to go on body weight as in kilograms of mature body weight. That's how we tend to ration animals. So we haven't really looked at that. I mean, this project I'm involved in, the Breed for Change project, which is looking at breeding low methane animals. We may be identifying some breed differences in methane output and requirements. Who knows? But it's not something that's been very specifically done, because you can imagine if we were comparing, we got 90 breeds in the UK, it would be a hell of a task to actually look at the requirements across all those different breeds. So it's not done, I would say. We do see a few differences, but in terms of rationing, we just tend to go on mature body weight, really.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, both to Sam and Kate. So I'm going to hand back to Jan now, and I think we've got Phil coming on shortly as well to wrap things up. So can I hand back to you, Jan?
Yeah, thanks very much, Susie, and thanks to Sam and Kate. Just to bring this edition of 2023 edition of SHWAP to a close, and perhaps more importantly, to comment on the whole Sheep Health Week, I've asked our NSA Chief Executive, Phil Stockett, to join us this evening and just say a few words. If you would, Phil, good evening.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Jan. I'm not sure if I'm capable of saying a few words. I've got quite a few.
No, well, that was an exaggeration.
No, I will say a few words, but it really is a privilege to be able to do this. I'll tell you, I am so proud of what the NSA team have achieved over this week. And when I say the NSA team, I mean, our staff, our officers, but I think that everyone that has contributed to all the activities that have been going on this week is in some way part of what I would say is the NSA family. People that have been our members for a long time, organisations that support our work, and I very much see everyone that's been involved as part of the NSA family. So I'm really proud of what everyone has managed to achieve during this week. Just a quick focus on this evening. I'd like to thank Susie, Sam Lane, and Kate Phillips for tonight's webinar. We've had some fantastic presentations on some really good questions and some even better answers, I would say, on a subject, nutrition, that is absolutely key to successful sheep production. On Monday night and Tuesday night, we had the same level of quality, I would say, in those webinars. And all of those sessions are available, or will be available shortly, on the NSA website as what I think will be a really valuable resource for future reference. So Jan started this evening by mentioning the linkages between health and welfare and productivity, that's SHWAP really. And Jan's absolutely right. The SHWAP brand was designed, I guess, developed by the NSA Southeast region, and it's become really well established. And they've now run a good number of really successful events. And it's also interesting, I would say, and probably encouraging too, that with the growing importance of the environment in its wider sense, greenhouse gases, climate change, the protection of natural resources and nature as well. You know, if we were going to start this process again, we might call it SHWAP and put an E on the end of it, because everything that we've talked about over this week not only has got a benefit for productivity, health, welfare, all those things, but everything that we've talked about has got a knock-on benefit for the environment as well. So again, that's just an interesting observation, I would say. So this week, our Eastern region have delivered SHWAP as what has become a really well-established event now. And we at the NSA have built on this to create a Sheep Health Week, adding the conference that we ran up at Birmingham on Wednesday. And we back this up with a lot of social media work and general noise about the importance of sheep health and welfare and productivity. I'm hoping that we're going to get quite a bit of pickup in the farming press over this next week or so. You know, sheep health is really, really important. It helps us improve our welfare. It does help us improve our productivity. It reduces our environmental footprint, our carbon footprint. And it's underpinned by the selection of animals and genetic selection, our genetic choice. It's underpinned by nutrition, management. And management, of course, is massively aided by records and data that enable us to make informed decisions. And that's been the essence of the SHWAP conference over these over the evenings during this last week. You know, now and again in life, I think there are times when, if you like, the stars align to enable things to happen, to enable change to happen. And I think that the potential for that to happen in our industry now exists. You know, we're going through a massive amount of change in agriculture and the sheep industry. The transition away from the basic payment system, the development of a whole range of new, I think and I hope quite meaningful government schemes, the opening up of these schemes to everyone, to people that haven't been eligible for basic payments in the past. Pathway is a good example of that, but it's not alone. There's other programs as well. The Small Capital Grants Program is a good example of that. We're seeing an income of or the injection, I guess, of a lot of new entrants into our industry, and that can only be good for us. We're seeing a massive amount of enthusiasm from vets, sheep vets, researchers, advisors, the pharmaceutical company. We've got collaborations like SCOPS that are coming in to give us a lot of technical information and again improve the situation for health, wealth, productivity of our industry. There is so much energy and enthusiasm, and now in my mind, we don't need to. You know, the last thing on earth we want to do is to sit back and feel that we've made progress. You know, we need to step things up even further and amplify these messages as much as we possibly can. So back to SHWAP and the work that the NSA Southeast region have been doing. A massive thanks to NSA Southeast region and the committee for all the work to bring this together. In particular, I need to mention Jan. Jan Ledoux is chair of the Southeast region and also a trustee of NSA. Susie, you know, you and Matt Blythe and Nerich Wright as well. And there's probably lots of other people that I could name, but I haven't. You know, thanks to all of you for pulling this event together. And again, my apologies for those people that have had input and that I've not mentioned. And finally, a massive thanks to our sponsors, all the chairs, the speakers. We could not do all this activity without your involvement and willingness to be involved. And I'd also just mention that anyone getting benefit from this work ought to know that pretty much all of the input we've seen this week has been given free of charge. Something that, again, demonstrates that farming is a business and is recognising it. It needs to be business focused, but it's more than a business as well, with a lot of people that are just so passionate about our industry and just keen to see it survive. So that's really about it. I just say keep an eye on NSA website, everyone, if you can, for future activities. If you're an NSA member, then we really appreciate your support. And if you're not, then, you know, please join us if you can, because this is a great organisation, and it really is, you know, an organisation where people are contributing a little, I think, for collective good for the whole industry. So if you can join us, please do. So again, big thanks to everyone for all the input that you've given over this week, and look forward to seeing you again soon and working with you all in the future. And with that, I'll pass back to Jan. Jan, are you there? Have you gone?
Would be if I remember to unmute myself. You think we'd learn how to do this blinking job by now on Zoom, wouldn't you? Many thanks for that, Phil. You've pinched a lot of what I was going to say, but I'm going to say it again anyhow, because I think people just need thanking. Thank you for that. And it remains for me just to thank on behalf of our regional committee all the speakers for our 3 evenings for their valuable contributions, the 3 chairs across the evenings for keeping order and marshalling the discussions. And I'd also like to thank very much the ladies in the back room, as it were, at NSA headquarters for their contribution in helping us organise, promote and running these events. Then just again, we mentioned it at the beginning, but again, we couldn't do it without them. Particular thanks to our sponsors, Rappa, Elanco, MSD, AgriWeb, British Wool and Cotswold Seeds. And last and by no means least, many thanks to all of you who've logged in and listened to the presentations and participated in the discussions. Each session has been recorded and so can be accessed via the NSA website and will be there and on YouTube, I think. The first one is already up there and the others will be pretty soon. I'm fairly certain we'll be back again in 2 years' time with SHWAP 25, although as Phil said, perhaps it should be SHWAP 25. That will definitely be for others to decide other than me, I suspect. But in the meantime, keep an eye on the NSA website events page for many more informative and interesting sheep themes activities, both from the Southeast region and all other regions across the country and nationally. And here, I'll just give a plug to the national event, Sheep 24, which will be in July next year. Oh, and I was also reminded by Kevin just now to plug the Scots podcasts, which have been slowly creeping their way out this week. I think there are 4. I can't for the life of me remember what each one was entitled, but Nicola probably put them up in the chat for anybody who wants to see it. With that, I'd just like to say good evening to you all and a personal thank you from me for attending. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.